Welcome back guys to Nuno Solutions. I'm Nuno, and in this video I'm going to show you guys how you can easily take JSON data and query it into a result set so you can see it as rows. And I'm going to use what you can see on the screen here. This code that you see here, this JSON data, is similar to what's already in my employees table. I'll show you what's in there. So I start from employees. There's 7 rows, and it's just, a data set of employee information. Very basic here, emp ID, emp name, emp phone, and emp email. And that took this data and I converted it into JSON using the video that I last made that shows you how to do that. Let's say you want to grab the first employee. You see here, so we have an emps property here, which is an array, and it has multiple employee objects. So let's say you wanted to just fetch, let's say the second employee, emp ID 2 and emp name Marco. How would you do that using a SQL query? Well, it's kind of easy actually. You're going to start off with a select, and if you just want to pull a specific row, you're going to use a statement called JSON value. By the way, if you're not using SQL Server 2016 and up, this won't work. JSON capabilities were first introduced in SQL Server 2016. All right, so we're gonna, this takes the first parameter. You can see here in the telesys is the JSON object or JSON data. So we're gonna grab my JSON data variable, place that in there, hit a comma. And now what this actually wants here, the second parameter is basically the path to the variable within the JSON data that you want to pull. So you start off this by using a $, hitting dot. What we want to pull first, if you look at JSON data, the first thing that we get here is this emps property. So we're going to pull from emps, and the value type, as you can see, because it starts with a bracket, it's an array. So you can't just do emps dot, like if you did this, this would fail. Let's just do this, and I'm going to query it like this and see what happens. If I run this, it should give me blank value, right? It's not finding it. And the reason why that is because there's multiple emp ID names in here, right? So because there's multiple objects with the same variable name, right? Same property name. So the reason why is because this is an array. You have to specify the index. And to do that, kind of like the way you do it in C#, if you're familiar, you use square brackets. And let's say you wanted to get the second one. This is 0 base, so you'd want to do a 1, which would be the second row. You run that. You can see it's pulling emp ID value 2. How do we know that? Well, let's prove it. Let's pull another JSON variable in here. I'm just going to copy this, hit comma, and paste. And I'm going to pull the emp name so that we can prove that it's really pulling this record here, the emp ID 2 with emp name Marco. So you can see here now that we're running this query, it is in fact returning the correct values that we wanted to get. The reason why there's no column names is because we haven't aliased it. So you could just very easily give it an alias like this, and then you got your rows with the proper column names that you want. So if you're fetching this into a C# or VB.NET application, you could reference it by name. This is all good and dandy, but like, what if you wanted to read all the emp IDs and all emp names, not just one specific one? How would you do that? Well, there's another keyword. I'm actually going to comment this out and hide the result set. I'm going to collapse this here actually so that it's not in the way. And I'm going to paste this query again. And this time, we're not going to use JSON value. We're actually going to use a different statement here. We're going to do from statement. What you're going to want to use here is called OPENJSON. And you're going to pass in the JSON data variable, right? And then in here, you can specify where to pull the data from. So let me collapse this. I'll expand that again because we kind of need to see that. So let's give it a path. We have to start this with a $, period. And let's say we just want to pull emps, this right here. See what happens if we run this like this, all right? And we're gonna say pull star. So just give me everything. If you run that, you'll see that it's actually pulling all the objects in the emps array, right? But it's returning back like a JSON value. You see what I'm saying here? And there's a couple interesting things here that to be aware of, right? Because this is an array, it's giving you a key value. With key value is basically the index of the object. So key 0, aka index 0, would be the index of the first object in the emps array. The other interesting thing here, obviously you get the value, right? Which gives you the value in JSON form. We'll figure out how to decode that later. But there's another column here called type. Type is basically the value type of there's basically the type or data type of the value. And there's a couple different data types in here, and I'm actually going to lay them out here for you in a comment. Let me just hide that over. I'm just going to paste that in here. So this is basically in SQL Server, the JSON value types. When you get that data type column, it's basically if it returns a type 1, that means that the value is a string. If it returns a type 2, that means that the type is a number. If it returns a 3, it's a boolean, a 4, an array, and a 5 is an object. You'll see here that really our value is actually a JSON object. So the type that it's being returned is type 5. So let's look into this and see how we can prove that this is actually what it's doing. So I have another JSON variable that I'm going to paste in here, and I'll explain in just a second. Let me just comment this out real quick. We're not going to want to run that. And I'm actually going to comment. Actually, I'm going to delete that for now. So if you look at the screen here, you can see the JSON value types in my comment appear. You'll see a new JSON data variable, varchar max, and you'll see here, this is the JSON data that's going to be tied to this JSON object, JSON variable. But you'll see I have different values in here. So I have a one here called where the name is string, and the value for this property is a string. Another property called number, and I'm just setting it to the number 3. Another property called boolean, and I'm just setting it to true. And another property called array, and I'm setting it to an array of A and B. These are just 2 strings, an array of strings, right? And then the last one is called, I named it object, and I'm just giving it a full object, right? It's an object with a name property in there. Okay, so let's query this and see what happens. And to do that, it's very simple. We're going to do a select star from, and again, we're going to use that keyword I was talking about, OpenJSON, and we're going to pass in the JSON data variable. That's it, nothing else. There's no second parameter for this. We're not using a second parameter for this. So let's just run this and see what we get. So very interesting, guys. Let me move back up to my JSON value types that I listed in here. So you can see here, the first property, JSON property that we're getting, the key name is string, right? And the value is, this is a string, and you can see that right here, right? And the thing that I really want to point out here, and the reason why I created this JSON structure to show you, is because SQL Server identifies what value type is being returned, and it's given it to you in this type column. So you may want to know what kind of, well, like when you're querying JSON data, you may want to make sure that the value that's being returned is a specific data type for a specific purpose. And when you're coding, this is like, it could be very important to you, like depending on what you're trying to do. But you can see really quickly, we have a string, which is type 1. We have number 3, which is type 2, which type 2 is for numbers or integers. And then a Boolean, which is returning a value of true, is a type 3. And I don't know if there's any other types, but these are the 5 types that I was able to identify as I've been working with the JSON data in SQL Server. So, okay, let's move on from this. The next thing is, let me hide this and let me actually delete this. You don't need this for now. I am going to uncomment the previous JSON payload. Okay, so back to where we were. So we were fetching just one specific row, right, using this query, and it's returning the second row, which is emp name Marco. But what if you wanted to return all the employees, right? How the hell do you do that, right? What's the correct way to do this? So if you want to convert this JSON data into rows, the way you would do this is, first of all, we're going to do a select from. We're going to use that statement again, OpenJSON, and we're going to pass in our variable name that represents our JSON data, which is @JSON-data. And then we're going to have a second parameter this time. So in this second parameter, whenever you're doing a path, you always do a $., and we're going to pull the emps. And if you we just do star like we did previously and we run this, again, it returns the value as an object, as a JSON object. But that's not what we want. We want to return these as actual columns, like emp ID as a column, emp name as a column, but all the rows of the data returned in a result set, the way you'd normally, like when you query a regular table, right? To do that, it's actually kind of easy. So you're going to use a combination of OpenJSON with JSON value. And then, first of all, number one, when you just do a select star, when you run this query, the select star, it returns you a key value and a type, right? So we're going to use JSON value, the JSON_value statement, to query the value column returned from this OpenJSON statement. So to do this, we're going to add in here a JSON_value. The first parameter, it's not going to be @JSON-data. It's going to be the value column that's returned down here. So we're gonna query. We're gonna use a JSON path using the JSON_value keyword to query the value column, right? So we're gonna add a comma in here, and very simple, just like we did before. We're gonna use a $., and here is where we're gonna specify the path to the column we want to retrieve, which is gonna be emp ID. And we're going to want to make sure we give this an alias, or else it won't have a column name. So we're going to say as emp ID, like that. And we're going to do the same thing for emp name. So let me just alias this with emp name, and let me change the path to emp name as well. And let me just get rid of this comma because that's giving me a little squigglies here. So, okay, so now what we have here is we have our JSON payload. And what this query is basically saying is, from our JSON payload, we want to look at the emps. We want to return the JSON information from the emps property, right, which is this one here. And then we're going to pull properties from emps. So when we run this, though, it'll actually return the properties for every single row, given that emps is an array. So let's run this and see what happens. Boom. So now when you run this query, you'll see now you have emp ID and emp name as a column. This, if you're trying to load data from SQL to VB.NET or C# or any other application, right? And you're running a stored procedure, you're running this query, this makes it very easy for you to access the data. Or even if you're using Entity Framework and you want to like have it auto-populate using the correct column name, right, to the property in the C# class, this is how you'd control it, because you can name the property whatever you want using the alias. Like here, you could do employee ID instead of emp ID, employee name. And if you run it again, now you have the column names that you want for the data within the JSON. So one other important thing that's very interesting and important here is that by default, there's two modes when you're using this path querying mechanism right here. When you're querying JSON data using the pathing in JSON pathing, by default, SQL Server has a pathing mode. A pathing mode, there's two types. There's lax mode and there's strict mode. By default, the default is lax mode. So let me actually just copy a thing here so you guys can see it on your screen. So the path modes, the default one is lax. It returns a blank value if the path that you enter it returns an error. So for example, if I run this, let's say that I had a typo I forgot to put the D in the emp ID path. Again, this is a path to the JSON to the JSON emp ID key, right? So I could fetch the value. If I run this, it's returning null because it cannot find emp I. There is no, in the JSON data, there is no emp I. There's emp ID, but not emp I. So by default, because the path mode is running under lax mode, it gives you a null value. But let's say you wanted to run this in strict mode. You do it like this. First of all, I just want to show that if you put the correct paths and you run this, it runs perfectly fine. No problems. It returns the data the way you want. But if you give it an incorrect path and then you run this, you'll see that you actually get an error, right? SQL Server throws an exception. It says property cannot be found in the specified JSON path. That's because the path that we're specifying doesn't exist in our JSON payload. So depending on your situation, you may want to turn on strict mode or you may not. I think most of the time you're going to be using lax mode. Again, you don't have to type lax in here because that's a default. So you'll see here, like, we're not getting an error. It's returning the data back, even though our employee ID path is incorrect. But again, if you don't specify lax, by default, it is lax. You'll see here still runs. And I think that's pretty much it, guys, for this. These different ways to query JSON data and convert it into data rows. You should be able to do just about anything that you need to. Please remember to like the video if you like the content, and also please subscribe if you're interested in seeing more and getting the latest updates of my new videos. Thank you so much, guys. Take care. Bye.